Stop.
Okay. So before we get into too much, what I wanted to start with was just kind of gauging where you're at as far as where you're at in the class. We've only had a few meetings so far, so whether you've been able to attend the meetings or just watch the video recordings, I just want to gauge where everyone is at as far as how much content you've actually been able to engage with.
So Ambriana says that she's kind of new to all this. I think this might be one of her first classes.
I read through your introduction PowerPoint and watched the first one and a little bit of the second one. Hi.
Okay. So it sounds like overall, and there have been a couple people who have been in a couple of the meetings, so I do recognize those folks, but otherwise it seems like for the most part, it's folks who are kind of just joining for the first time, which is good because there are particular conversations I wanted to have that are actually kind of going back to the beginning of when we started meeting together, some of the important conversations we were having about how we're going to kind of come into this space. So before I get into that, another question that I had was just generally speaking, because African spiritualities is a very large kind of umbrella, right? A lot of different things can kind of fall under that. Africa is an entire continent. So I'm wondering, what general knowledge do you have about different African spiritualities? We've been talking about Yoruba specifically, and a little bit of Hoodoo as well, which is kind of an offshoot of that same spiritual tradition that comes from Nigeria. But other than that, do you folks have any knowledge about African spiritualities in general? It doesn't have to be relevant to this course, but just anything and everything. Just wondering if you have any kind of exposure.
I can go first too, because I haven't really answered this, so sure. So for me, one of the reasons that I really wanted to have this class at the Academy is because genuinely, no. The most that I go is Egypt, and I have a lot of background in Egypt, and I know a lot about different Egyptian practices, spiritualities, the different translations that have happened from Egyptian, what we would now call witchcraft, but really it was just translating different spells that were written on different sarcophagus findings. So that's really my background, and that's about it. So I really wanted to learn a lot more. Okay, and then Ambriana answered in chat. And I think a few others are answering in chat too.
I'm just to let you know, I'm just taking notes of what you're telling me, just so I have an idea of the directions we might want to go from here. And I'll just give you another minute if you didn't have a chance to respond yet in the chat if that feels more comfortable.
I'm also I know a lot about Hermeticism, which also originated in Egypt. But yeah, no, I guess it's mostly Egypt, which is, yeah, why I'm really excited to learn more. I've definitely heard of a lot of different spiritual practices in Africa. I've heard them named, I've heard them talked about because I've been studying all this for so long, but I've never actually found a mentor or a teacher so that I could actually learn about them. And I don't really count hearing the name as knowing anything. So
so the jaguar medicine is actually specific to indigenous cultures in South and Central America.
There you go. That's my knowledge. Sorry.
No worries. Okay. Okay, so one thing I want to do really quickly before I ask any more questions and get into anything else is I want to give a little bit of general knowledge, jumping back to the very first week we got together and talked about some of the things we want to be mindful of as we're kind of coming into this space and engaging with this history. So let me just pull up my notes really quickly so you can see them. And I think these would be the notes that you all already have access to. So if you've had a chance to look them over, you've at least had an opportunity to kind of get a little bit of exposure to what I'm going to talk about. So the reason we're using the language of African spiritualities rather than religions is the term religion implies separation from aspects, other aspects of our culture, society, or environment. And what I'm going to talk about here in a moment, bypassing would be a part of that, kind of trying to separate, for example, our spiritual self from the other aspects of our lives in particular ways, right? And it gets done in ways that are used to kind of avoid accountability from engaging in harm, avoid engaging tough emotions like anger, right? Engaging anger is seen as not being in alignment with kind of spiritual practice, that kind of thing. So I'll talk about that here in a minute. So using the language of spirituality actually does imply that we're talking about that interconnected relationship with all aspects of our lives. So we can't divorce our spiritual selves from any other part of our identities. And that includes our experiences, the way that we kind of navigate society and the world around us, with keeping in mind that some of us have particular privileges, right, and don't necessarily experience the same structural barriers as others. So we want to kind of be mindful of those types of things. So it's pluralistic in nature there. It's multidimensional. We're talking about the connections to culture, society, environment. For a lot of these spiritual practices, identities in Africa, culture is a big part of that, right? Culture, culture is a part of our ethnicity. So ethnic identity in this context becomes really important to kind of how folks are identifying and what spiritual traditions they're practicing. So that's a piece of their very identities as well. And it's rooted in their particular cultural backgrounds or ethnic identities and where their families are coming from, which part of Africa. And, within a particular tradition, there are going to be variations in how that gets practiced. On the continent, there are a lot of different ethnic groups that speak multiple languages. you know, they're within a particular shared geographic space, but they might have different cultural practices, different interpretations of these spiritual traditions, and so on. And we even see that here, you know, in the context of for Native Americans, right? Obviously, there are different nations, different tribes, nations being better language. But we still see within, you know, one nation, there are going to be various different kind of understandings, interpretations, practices. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And that becomes important because one thing I talked about in the beginning is we want to get away from these frameworks where there's kind of one correct way of viewing the world, one kind of correct cultural perspective or viewpoint, you know, worldview, that kind of thing. I like to talk about when I'm working with students, what's called kind of partial knowledges or situated knowledges. All that is saying is that, you know, we come from different backgrounds. We come from different forms of training, different levels of education, different identities, different experiences. And based on all of those distinctions in our identities and experiences, we see the world very differently. All of those elements kind of shape our worldview and our perspectives. So we can have these different perspectives and they can be simultaneously valid. I want to be clear, though, that doesn't mean that all perspectives are valid. That just means that it's not this kind of one correct way of viewing the world and everything else is wrong, right? There can be multiple kind of coexisting or complementary truths, right, or realities without kind of one perspective being kind of the correct way. This becomes important because most of us, if not all of us, are coming from a Western context where even for those of us who are of African descent, we have privilege coming from the West and being able to kind of implement or enforce kind of a Western viewpoint or a Western perspective for understanding and engaging with these traditions. That comes with a lot of privilege. The bulk of the history of the continent of Africa has actually been dominated by white male historians, and that's been done for a very particular reason. It serves a purpose. So we want to be really mindful of how we're engaging with this content. For me personally, it's always important to center those who are actually practitioners, those who are members of these traditions. You know, folks who are actually, you know, these are their ancestral traditions. So these are my ancestral traditions, for example. And I'm going to be seeking out those voices and really centering that perspective, what's called an Afrocentric perspective, right? We're talking about Black people's lives, their realities, their cultures. So we're going to center their voices in the conversations, right? Rather than kind of centering an outside looking in kind of perspective where folks are kind of imposing their own gaze and their own frameworks for kind of understanding African traditions. I might actually really quickly also get into a pinch of the history just to explain a little bit more as to why we want to be mindful. Let me just see where it is. And again, it's really holistic. So even the ways we understand illness in the body is viewed as kind of an imbalance in the social life, the spiritual, all of those different aspects of life. There are some traditions where we would kind of recognize these kind of spiritual wounds or soul wounds that are connected to different aspects of our lives and kind of have that, you know, physical implication, illness in the body, you know, whether that be physical illness, mental illness, dealing with trauma in particular ways, unhealed trauma, those types of things. So we're looking at all of those interconnected aspects and seeing them as kind of interconnected, right? We can't really separate all of the different elements of our identities. So I want to talk just a little bit really quickly about the history. So what ends up happening, and this is getting really deep into the history of enslaved Black people in the United States specifically, who brought Yoruba over. In the United States, it ends up because of obviously bringing the African spiritual traditions, the indigenous spiritual traditions of Native Americans on the land, and then the European religious background as well. So it depends on who the colonizers were. That would either be Christianity or Catholicism. Those kind of elements were meshed together in a way that created these kind of newer manifestations of Yoruba. So in the United States, we end up with hoodoo and voodoo, for example. And I'll be talking about that a little bit later on, but this is actually getting into that history a bit. What ended up happening was for our non-European, so I want to say something really quickly. we have this narrative, we are the granddaughters of the witches you couldn't burn, right? And maybe you've heard some of the critique of that, that narrative, that framework, and who's kind of identifying themselves in the legacy. This would be why, in the context of colonization, European colonialism in the United States, that would be obviously stealing the land from indigenous people here, displacing them from the land. I think I mentioned genocide, and then enslaving Black people. For us who are colonized people, we were not allowed to engage in our spiritual traditions. There were punishments, right? Violence was used, for example. You folks may, especially right now, be hearing about Indian boarding schools where Native children were separated from their families and forced to learn English, not speak their indigenous languages, not wear their traditional clothing. They had to wear American clothing, change their names, right? We have these extensive histories of our cultures being eradicated intentionally. And this is a part of it, right? Not being able to practice our spiritual practices because they were seen as a threat in the context of rebellions, in the context of uprisings and resistance to colonization specifically. So it's really meaningful to be able to have access to this kind of history, this kind of knowledge, and we have to understand the power imbalances at the heart of these types of conversations, right? So again, for these European colonizers, they were banning our spiritual practices, African spiritual practices, forcing people to learn about Christianity, participate in Christianity for particular reasons. So we want to be really mindful of the kind of extensive history of violence that's kind of at the heart of how we get into some of these other traditions, right? If we didn't have the transatlantic slave trade, taking African people from the continent and selling them throughout various countries around the world, we wouldn't have all of these different variations of Yoruba that we know about today. And let me just pull the list. And this is not all of them either, but Haitian Vodou, Lukumi, which I think is specific to Puerto Rico, Santeria, which I think is more specific to Cuba and parts of the Caribbean. So all of these different manifestations of this tradition because of this history of colonization, right? So we have to understand these traditions in the context of resistance and rebellion to oppressive systems, right, that are especially rooted in colonization and white supremacy and capitalism and patriarchy, right? We could kind of look at all of them. So I just want to reiterate being mindful of kind of how we're showing up here and what our relationships to this kind of content is. One thing that I would kind of like to ask folks before I get into more is I actually want to kind of gauge where you're at as far as how you kind of come into engaging with different spiritual traditions that are rooted in cultures kind of outside of your own. So when you're engaging with, especially non-European spiritual traditions, how are you kind of practicing mindfulness to ensure that you're not causing harm, to ensure that you're not kind of being appropriative in particular ways? How are you kind of mindful when you're engaging in other practices? I think that's a really important question. And this is the kind of stuff that I like to start weaving into the class a little bit more, having these conversations and always kind of doing this check. What's called self-reflexivity. I think I actually have that in the notes and I can just pull that up so you can see it. But what self-reflexivity is, let me just see if I can find the notes. Okay, here it is. So we want to intentionally examine our own beliefs, values, ideas, our behaviors, and look at the foundations of where they come from, right? Am I engaging, especially in the context of these larger power dynamics, am I engaging in oppressive ways of thinking, oppressive ways of acting? Am I kind of reinforcing some of these problematic assumptions that might be, in this case, rooted in anti-Blackness, that kind of thing. So we want to be mindful of what our own relationships to power are in this context. So some of us are coming from privileged backgrounds where we've had more of those connections to our traditions. We've had more of those connections to ancestral knowledge, which again, some of us, names were changed, records destroyed, that connection kind of being severed, right? Those identities kind of being lost in many ways. So being mindful of the significance of having access to this kind of stuff for folks who maybe aren't used to being kind of decentered, right? What does it mean that there are other traditions that you've maybe never had an opportunity to engage in that you actually have access to now? What does it mean to kind of show up respectfully, appropriately, and understand the significance of having access to this kind of knowledge? It's really important. So we want to be able to kind of understand what's my relationship to power. Am I experiencing, for most of us, we do experience varying levels of oppression and privilege. In this context, we might be talking more about privilege because, again, some of us do have access to our own kind of traditions and things like that. Some of us have experienced the legacies of colonization and forced assimilation, right? Being forced into the dominant social institutions, laws, policies, practices, cultural values, etc., of our American culture, right? Which does not really bring everyone along. I kind of talked about that before, right? In order to kind of take on this American identity, we had to lose a lot of, if not all of, our cultural history, knowledges, identities, practices, right? There's not really space made for that. So these are just things to be mindful of. And there will always be moments to kind of check in and do a self-reflexivity check. I'd like to bring that into the work as much as possible because I think it's really important as a general practice to engage in. So I'd like to just really quickly ask the question of how do you engage in conscious practices when you're kind of engaging with non-European, especially spiritual traditions? And I want to know as well, it sounds like you folks have had these types of conversations, so I'd love to know what you've already talked about.
I can go first. Just briefly, there's a lot of, I feel like it is all, this is something that I have been trying to work on for a very, very long time and consciously think about and grow in many different ways since I was very little, because I learned about these traditions from my family, because my family, I'm a first generation American from a family that comes from Syria and Lebanon. And so most of the practices that I have learned and the history that I have learned I've been lucky enough to have it be from family and from people who actually practice these traditions in the countries that I'm learning about. And so that was really nice to begin with. And then I kind of stemmed from there, and it was really important to me to get mentors and people who taught me who are actually from those countries. I did a lot of traveling, which I'm privileged to do. And so a lot of mine comes from a certain degree of privilege because I was able to go travel, I was able to seek out mentors, and I was also able to have a connection with family and with people who came from those cultures. And then also when I am practicing in the United States and learning from people here, I try to make sure that if I am learning from someone who is European, then that the place that they teach at or the place that they teach from is a place that gives back to all of those communities and is somewhere that they give back to indigenous communities, they give back to specific, whatever community that they are also teaching about. I feel like that's really important. And I have actually, as I've grown up, wanted to seek more non-European teachers and mentors just in general. And so I haven't really gone that route in a really long time when it comes to learning about non-European traditions. Obviously, I have lots of mentors that are European that are teaching me about European practices and practices that either originated in Europe or all that we know of at this moment is that it originated in Europe. And I've learned as we gain knowledge about science and anthropology that actually we're learning a lot of these traditions didn't originate in Europe. And therefore then I try to expand my knowledge and seek out different mentors. But yeah, it's a really big, long, growing process.
I'm gonna pull a teacher move and just wait for folks to respond to the question before we move on. I get paid to make people feel uncomfortable, so I find entertainment in it a little bit. I'd like to challenge you because there's privilege in the silence, right? There's privilege in not having to engage with our positions. So this is going to be a lot about challenging that and challenging you to think more deeply and more consciously about how you're showing up in these types of spaces and what it means to be able to access. So I appreciate that access was framed as a privilege, right? How do we get to kind of come into these traditions? In this class, I don't want you to be a fly on the wall, right? You're going to have to actually kind of engage and do some self-reflexive work where we're going to kind of turn the mirror inward a little bit and challenge the ways that we're engaging as spiritual practitioners. I personally see a lot of violence that gets committed by folks who are coming from particular spiritual backgrounds. And this is why we're going to get into the conversation about spiritual bypassing here in a moment. But there's a level of responsibility, right, when we're kind of coming into these spaces, especially for folks who are doing this work, especially if you're doing this work for financial benefit or personal benefit. So I think that that becomes really significant to kind of challenge yourselves, lean into the discomfort, right? It's not going to be, this might not be kind of the fun class where we get to kind of coast through. There might be some moments of discomfort, but that's a part of doing the work. And part of the traditions being rooted in, again, combating oppression, right? Resistance, trying to dismantle these systems that have been causing violence to particular communities just based on the groups that they belong to. So I can give you, if you need some time to process as well, I can wait 5-10 minutes. And then we can kind of come back around to some of the things you're saying. And then I'm going to jump into, again, a reiteration of talking about appropriation, but I also want to talk about exploitation in a different context. That's a little bit more complicated and to me a little bit different, kind of within the same framework of appropriation, but a little bit different. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll talk about the spiritual bypassing as well. And what's called toxic positivity, if you're familiar.
As far as the things we've talked about, I really, a couple of people have answered in chat and I'm reading it, but I'm really excited to hear what other people say about the things that we've gone over because I know a lot of those classes are my classes. But as far as toxic positivity, that is something that we've gone over in lots of classes because it bugs the shit out of me. So just...
You don't say!
Right? Oh my God! I talk about it in so many classes, so it is definitely something that we bring up a lot. And I rant. God, when the academy was first growing, I used to like go on at 1 o'clock in the morning and rant to everybody about how much I hated toxic positivity and how we had to stop that. So yeah, that is something that we've talked a lot about in class. And also, hi Cynthia. And if you didn't hear Corey's question, I would love for you to participate and answer too. So if it's okay with you, if you didn't hear, maybe Corey can repeat the question.
Yes, I'll repeat the question and also type it up in the chat just so you have a visual. The question was essentially, how are you engaging kind of mindful or conscious practices around how you are engaging when you're coming into learning about participating in non-European spiritual traditions?
Oh, can I answer just like in voice or do you want me to write it?
Whichever you feel comfortable with.
So for me, I grew up in a very like conservative household that was very closed-minded, and as Alex said, grew up in a lot of toxic positivity, as a lot of the Christians like to do, just to keep gaslighting you into the religion. But but coming out to Colorado and meeting new people and unlearning a lot of those habits and those mindsets and everything like that is really like it is life changing. Like I've had to learn to tell for people to tell me, hey, that's offensive to me, and me just be like, okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. How can I improve for the next time? Whereas I see a lot of people just be like, well, how can you be offended by something like that? I wasn't trying to offend you. For me, it took learning to just take a step back and being like, look, I can't decide what doesn't offend somebody. And I've had to, undo a lot of weird things that I grew up with. Such as like, buying sage. I don't buy sage anymore, or Palo Santo wood or anything like that unless I check the sources first. And I even sometimes confer with Alex, like, hey, would this be a good idea to buy? I didn't really get any good sources on it. Usually she'll say no unless I can verify that it came from someone who wasn't being exploited for it. Which unfortunately, Five Below, they exploit a lot of people. So I was like, okay, we're not doing that anymore. Or like explaining to my father why the Black Lives Matter movement is so fucking important, and how, it's his view of the world is completely different than what a lot of other people witness and experience. And I think getting out there and experiencing it and talking with people who have experienced it really helps to change your perception and your viewpoint on things. So yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm just taking some notes on the things that you're saying so we can kind of come back around and address some of these things in more depth. And I just need to take a minute really quickly to look at the comments as well.
No worries.
But thank you for your contribution. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah, we do game night with some friends of ours every now and then. And Omari, really, he and I talk a lot about the human experience and what he experiences versus what I experience. And I'm just there to sit and listen and be like, well, how can people fix this? Like, what would you offer as a solution? Not even just trying to combat them on it, just listening to what people are saying. So I think that's the biggest thing we can do as humans to move forward, is just to listen.
I love what you said, Cynthia. I totally can relate to you hardcore. I too grew up in an extremely Christian home, albeit my dad actually was what I would call a true Christian, where he actually practiced Christ's love. And he loves homosexuals, and he did things that the church actually ostracized him for. So I had an interesting perspective growing up, seeing that happen. And a lot of the doctrines on Christianity just didn't jive with my soul. So I actually began a spiritual opening journey right out of the gates when I left my parents' house. And, at this point, I'm just there to, I like what you said, listen and hear and learn and hear about other people's experiences. I also like what you said about supporting companies, because I saw that on the slides too. Not a lot of times we think about how our simple monetary expenditures day to day, like in Amazon Prime and otherwise, are actually bringing oppression about. And we're in turn supporting it just by getting our daily dose of mind sludge to relax to, at the end of the night. I don't know. I think it's interesting. I was also involved helping out my friend Eli in BLM movements and doing the book studies they were doing on Discord. So I'm just happy to be here. Thanks for having me. This is actually one of my first classes, so thanks.
Yay, welcome. I'm glad that your dad is very accepting of homosexuals in the queer community. My dad is not. He is not. He doesn't even know that I'm engaged. I've been engaged for a while, or that I was even dating a woman for 6 years.
Hmm.
But also we adopted my brother from Guatemala, and my mom, God bless her soul, well, there is one at this point, wherever she is, her dad, my grandfather, was very racist. He created, a separate account for me for when he died, for my inheritance, but he wasn't willing to create one for my brother. And I remember that fight in the kitchen. Oh, he almost got kicked out of the house. That was something. Long story short, we both have one now. It's fine. Like, it got resolved. But also, when it comes to listening, I think the best thing we can do is listen without having something to say about it, unless it's a question that pertains to how can we move forward. Because it's one thing to listen and be like, well, yeah, but what about this and this and this, like in a condescending manner. Like when I'm talking with my dad about political issues, because we're on opposite sides of the spectrum, he's like, well, he literally said this to me the other day. You stand for Black Lives Matter and they stand for it, but what about black on black crime? Like, that's not what we're talking about right now. That's not, you need to listen. You need to hear what these people are trying to say, and you need to understand that they come from somewhere completely different. You have the privilege of being raised in a very, money, like, you have good money, you have white privilege, you have straight cis male white privilege, you have all the privilege in the world. And that's good for you, but a lot of people don't have that. And until you can recognize, privileges exist, then it's just like talking to a wall. We've gotten in many bad phone conversations about this. Even it's been something else, but that's all I can do is just listen. Like, I listen to what Alex has to tell me because my experience was different from hers. I listen to what my friend Omari has to say because he grew up in Colorado Springs, but it was different for him. Everybody's life has been different. Anyway, sorry, I'm really tired. I'm running on 2 hours of sleep, so I'm probably just rambling.
I'm the same way. And this is just going off of one of the things you said, just as a talking point for folks that don't know, with the whole Black on Black crime argument, we see the same patterns across racial lines. So white people are killed primarily by white people. Latina folks are killed primarily by Latina folks because of what's called redlining. So we've created these racially segregated neighborhoods back in the 1930s. Because we were denying immigrants and people of color homeowner loans. So 90 years out, because of the passing down of cyclical debt, cyclical poverty, those same communities are still segregated. So we're seeing those patterns because of racial segregation. So that's just a counter argument. But anyway, I'm just looking at the comments here really quickly and taking note of them before we come back together. So if you need to take a bathroom break, we can take 5 really quickly. And just come back in a few minutes.
Thank you for that. I actually told him that, and this was in our conversation about critical race theory and why it's important. Because I was telling him that, and he goes, "Well, I didn't learn that. That didn't happen." I'm like, but it did. A lot of our history has been whitewashed and made palatable, and as a professor in my college said, if you have a good fuzzy feeling about history, it's not being taught correctly. because history is violent and gruesome and terrible and awful, but it's important to know so that we don't repeat the same mistakes.
And yeah, I feel like too that throughout, I have never owned my own business. And though this is not a business because I do not take payment, I don't really know what a business is actually defined as. But anyway, I have never owned anything like this of my own and tried to do something like this. And so I definitely feel like in this topic and in this way, I am trying to grow a lot more because my voice is being heard, and my voice has never been heard before. And so because I know that my voice is being heard and that I am somebody who people are, I guess, listening to in a sense, or taking advice from, or taking spiritual guidance from, that I have a lot more to learn as well and a lot more to grow. And I feel like admitting the fact that you have a lot more learning to do and that you don't know all of the correct answers and all of the things that make, I don't know everything when it comes to how to make sure that nobody is harmed and that I am not continuing to support the patriarchy and and everything else that puts people in harm's way and that affects people in negative ways. And so therefore I also feel like this is a new experience for me where I have to learn more and how to grow even more, because for the first time my voice matters more than it did before. If that makes sense.
Oh, also, when Alex, Mia's coming back in 2 weeks.
Oh, yay, good. I'm glad. Awesome.
We're so excited. We're so excited. Her parents emailed us and they're like, hey, we did look at other centers and she tried other centers because while we were waiting to hear back from you guys for care, unfortunately, we won't be returning to those centers because, again, they refuse to adhere to their diet. And they tried to feed her, they did morning breakfast and they tried to feed her bacon. Yeah, that was fun. Also, I have a friend from college who is Muskogee Creek, and she's actually registered with her tribe as Muskogee Creek. If you ever need someone from, the indigenous population to talk to about appropriation or things like that, I think she would be a good one. She's the one I asked you, like, hey, if she gifted this to me, would it be appropriation if I used it or kept it? The sage bundle she made. So, but yeah,
That's awesome. Thank you. And I'm always glad that you come to me with questions. And that's kind of what I meant too by the fact that my voice matters, is that people come to me for questions. And
if I question, like, if I question, oops, sorry. I love asking you guys questions because I love learning how to better help people and how to be a better person towards people. Also, it gets my mind off of Alexander, who's 3 years old and still not potty trained. Hey.
I'm going to pull up a resource here in just a second to share with y'all, just based on some of the things that are coming up.
Hi, Rosalie. So there's a question. Oh, I don't know. Can you see
I didn't type it. I'm sorry.
Oh.
Let me type it now. I'll,
No, that's totally cool. I was just making sure. Thank you, Corey, so much. So there's a question that we're all answering. Feel free to answer using your voice or using text. Also, hi.
Hi, sorry I came late. How long is class going for?
8, 9. We go until 9, so you still have an hour.
Oh, good, thank goodness.
So I saw your question, Corey, and I'm just gonna go ahead and say, because I've actually engaged in a lot of like others' cultures, traditions with doing ceremonies, with gosh, all sorts. I joined a Native American tribe, some Lakota, and they're still my family. If I go show up at a sweat, they accept me with open arms, and Wiccan, just a whole branch of Buddhist temples, and entering into that that space with absolute just sacred, having this sacred mindset. And then, like everyone else has been saying, just being quiet and listening and not doing what everyone else is doing is really important because sometimes you don't know the different traditions and spiritualities roles, may it be even gender roles, whether I agree with them or not. You know, for example, in my Lakota drive, I can't drum, you know, I can't speak first, but that's okay. That's what they do. And I still get to experience such a beautiful um, tradition and being able to do sweats and stuff like that and having them just be open. It's amazing. And I feel special, and I can just express respect and waiting and letting people tell me what to do.
Did folks need another minute to kind of address the question? There was something that came up that I was just asking for elaboration on as well, if you feel comfortable. Oh yeah, perfect, thank you. But if folks need another minute, we can just take one more minute. I'm just writing down what Erica was saying so we can come back to these points. Are you all familiar with the characteristics of whiteness or of white supremacy culture?
Yes.
Yes, for the most part, always willing to learn more.
Okay.
Yeah. Was I on mute? No, yeah. Yes.
I'm going to pull it up anyway, just in case folks haven't seen it. And I wanted to kind of talk about an example really quickly here in a moment. Just one more comment I wanted to get through.
I agree with you, Kevin and Kieran, by the way, completely. In tarot classes, that's something that I've definitely been working on with tarot reading in general. It's been quite the journey when it comes to tarot in general, because there are just so many different ways that tarot has been a part of. There are so many different ways that tarot is both appropriated and also is appropriation, and also there's just so many things with tarot. And I totally agree with you when it comes to the gender binary and heteronormative culture when it comes to the way that we teach tarot in the United States and the way that we teach astrology, tropical astrology in the United States. And that is one of the things that I'm working on, is how to change that without just kind of deciding that I'm going to completely change the way that it's taught, and actually change it to be more like the cultures that it originated in. Because gender binary, I don't know, the spectrum that we've put the gender binary on is very Western. And therefore, if I just go back to the cultures that originally taught and originally came up with a lot of the symbology behind tarot, a lot of the ways they taught had nothing to do with a gender binary spectrum anyway. And so trying to learn how to do that rather than just creating my own way, I'm going back to, and since it originated in the Middle East, I get to go ask a lot of family members about different ways that the numerology was depicted back in the Middle East, because a lot of them studied back when they, a lot of them still live in Lebanon and Syria, but the ones that live here, back when they did live there, a lot of them studied a lot of numerology and Arabic numerology. And Arabic numerology is what we use for tarot. So anyway, that's something that I am completely aware of, and you're right, and I completely agree.
Okay, I wanted to engage just really quickly with the things that you were all saying, and we can get into some conversation as well. So always feel free to jump in, or if you feel more comfortable engaging in the chat, that always works too. I'm keeping an eye on it, and I know Alex is keeping an eye on it as well. So one of the things that was identified is the significance of learning from practitioners who are actually coming from those traditions, those cultures. And I think that that's really important. And one thing with that, and I know some of you folks said, there are people in my life who I have personal relationships with who in particular ways have kind of served in that role as educating. And so with that, I want to kind of offer something to be mindful of as well when you are learning from people in your life. One thing to be mindful of is, are you kind of going to them and asking them questions, trying to learn more, and kind of think about it this way, kind of putting that labor onto them without asking them if they feel comfortable. So make sure that you check in with the boundary, do you feel comfortable engaging this type of labor? Otherwise, someone else did mention, I want to make sure that I'm going to people who I know are offering these resources. So for example, even if we were talking about racism, racial oppression, white supremacy in a general sense, it's important to learn about these things from people of color, but it's not our responsibility to teach people these things. So some of us, myself included, right, I teach ethnic studies, Africana studies, women's studies. So I do this kind of work willingly. So people like me, right, use us as the resources, those of us who are making ourselves available and providing those resources. And think about compensation as well, right? So Alex mentioned that obviously in the context of for spiritual practitioners who are making money off of these practices, and maybe I'm sure you folks are familiar with some of these individuals. They make a lot of money, some of them, right, off of doing this kind of work. And if they are, so just going back, let me just pull the notes up really quickly. Just going back to appropriation really quickly. It's actually geared up this time. Cool. Okay. So just going back to appropriation, that's the whole point, right? The whole issue with appropriation is there some kind of social benefit or some type of financial or monetary reward that comes from engaging in other people's cultures or kind of taking elements from those cultures. So it's really important that folks, to me personally, I don't think it's appropriate in any context to be benefiting off of the spiritual traditions of others, even again with the consideration that there's a social benefit, and I'll get into that more here in a moment. But yes, if there are folks who are putting that money into communities that are actually coming from those cultural backgrounds or that are actually kind of rooted in those spiritual teachings, I think that's important. If you're going to seek out people who are not members of those cultures, which I would advise against, it's kind of like a last case scenario, and that's how I'd want to think about it. With the social benefit, so even if there are white folks who are teaching about Yoruba, for example, and they're not making any money off of it, or they give every dime of that money away to a particular community in Nigeria that's helping provide food to members of the community or something like that, right? That's really important, and giving back to those communities. They're still benefiting socially. So going back to the history of forced assimilation, right? Forcing many of us not to speak our own languages, engage our own cultural practices. We still see these types of things today. So there is a Black culture, right? We've been kind of severed from our African roots, but we do have a Black culture. And so we see this thing happen where for Black people, when we engage in our own culture, all of a sudden we're demonized for it, we're punished for it. Think about the ways we sexualize Black girls and women's bodies. So, we could all, those of us who are femme or who are marked as girls or women and read as such, we may say in particular social institutions we're impacted by dress code policies, right, that police our bodies, police our sexualities, and sexualize our bodies in particular ways. But that's not going to look the same for everyone, right? We're hypersexualizing Black girls and women. And because of that, we're policing their bodies in a particular way where, if we have a kind of full-figured Black woman, for example, we're seeing her as hypersexual, demonizing her, slut-shaming her, what have you. But those same features, physical features on a white body are going to be seen as desirable, attractive, right? Kim Kardashian, right? All of the Kardashians technically, right? We could use as an example of that. When they engage in Black culture, all of a sudden cornrows are Bo Derek braids. I think I used this example before, right? There's so much rich history behind those braids. Those braids were significant because during slavery, enslaved people would actually weave seeds into their hair so that when they were escaping slavery, they had food to grow. So we lose a lot of that history when we then attribute, so calling it Bo Derek braids, this is a white woman, a white actress who in 1979 was in a movie where she donned cornrows, right? So we're kind of erasing Black people from our own cultural practices and the significant history behind them, and kind of attributing it to white people. And so all of a sudden, white people are seen as very cultured, seen as kind of being very caring, very well traveled, right? All of this praise that comes with it. For folks who are in the cultures, they receive critique, they receive criticism. So it's a very different system. So I would really challenge the idea of using white practitioners if we're not talking about their own ancestral traditions. I think that's really important. And that might be an unpopular opinion, but that's the reality, right? Is that many of us for centuries have been murdered for speaking our own languages, engaging our own cultural practices. And I could go into so many examples, but I don't want to kind of get off track here. So that's just something to be mindful of. And I do appreciate the recognition of what it means to have opportunities to actually be able to travel and go into these spaces and engage the practices. I don't think we talked about Eat, Pray, Love. Maybe I asked you folks if you read the book or you've seen the movie. That's a really great example, right? She was going out to different countries and participating in different spiritual spaces, but she was doing so in a very particular type of way where she was not being mindful. We would think of traveling as wanting to learn about other cultures, right? Wanting to kind of participate in the cultures. She was actually going, and here comes the privilege again, right? When I talk about us coming from a Western context, even for those of us who are poor here in the United States, even for those of us who are people of color in the United States, when we go out to non-Western nations, we have a level of privilege over other folks, so we can kind of wield over them. And that's something that we've got to be really mindful of. There's that socioeconomic privilege on a global level. So I might be poor here in the US, but I can afford to go out to parts of the world that have been impacted by slavery, that are now some of the poorest nations in the world, right? Because what happened with slavery is after slavery was abolished, white property, plantation owners essentially said, well, we're about to lose out on all of these profits. You owe us, you're indebted to us for those lost profits, right? Because we can't exploit you anymore for your labor. So we want to be kind of mindful of these types of privileges that show up, even those of us who are, again, coming from more marginalized backgrounds here, engaging in non-Western contexts, we do have a level of privilege, right? We do have a level of preferential treatment. And when we're engaging in these traditions, one thing I talked about as well is because we have a level of kind of cultural distance, these aren't our identities or our ancestral practices. So what happens is because we have that kind of cultural distance, we can really exoticize these spiritual traditions, right? And kind of make them a lot bigger and grander than they actually are. So I just want to pull this up. I love this reference. I've mentioned it before. If you folks recall, and maybe you had a chance to read it. It's a great NPR article, really brief, just talking about how, in the Western world, we have exoticized the word namaste, right? Namaste is a simple greeting, a hello, goodbye, right? Nothing flashy, nothing fancy about it, nothing deep about it. It's a greeting. But then for white people who are not a part of the tradition, who have that cultural distance in Western nations, have begun participating in yoga, what happens is all of a sudden it's taken on this deeper meaning, right? It's been exoticized. So all of a sudden it means the light in me bows to the light in you, right? In these grand statements. That has nothing to do with the culture of origin that it's come from. All of a sudden, for other folks, again, coming from these Western contexts, it's now been completely decontextualized from its cultural origins. I don't know any better personally, right? So if I don't know any better and I'm hearing this from someone else, I may think, oh, wow, right? Again, you're very knowledgeable. You're very well kind of traveled. You give a shit about other people's cultures, right? That becomes an area for praise. Some of us, obviously, if this is my lived reality, of course I'm going to care. But all of a sudden, there are these kind of kudos that white folks get for caring about other people's cultures and participating, engaging with other people's cultures. So going back really quickly to that example of Eat, Pray, Love. So one thing that folks may or may not know is she actually had the book deal before she went on this trip. So this was a premeditated thing. We kind of the framework becomes that it's kind of this spiritual awakening, this kind of process of becoming, of finding herself, which is a very spiritual thing, but we end up doing this in ways that are actually exploiting people of color in the process. So when we travel, right, how are we engaging with people of color? And maybe positioning them in a way where we're trying to kind of use them to get particular experiences. So just being mindful of that. But when she goes on her travels, she's going to, I think, India. I think she went to Indonesia. She went to Italy. And when she's in these spaces, obviously Italy is a little bit of a different example. But when she's in these spaces, she ends up going to American spaces, right? Maybe not companies, I should say, but she's going to spaces that are run by, owned by, facilitated by Americans, right? Or folks from Western nations who just happen to have some land in another country, right? So what happens is a lot of white women read the book, see the film, get really inspired by it, and kind of follow her spiritual journey in ways where the type of tourism they were engaging in. So she's going to these different, or people are going to these different countries, but who's making the profit? Right, off of these white folks, American folks, Western tourists going into spiritual spaces. Well, American companies, right, who are the ones kind of running these places, not the locals. So being able to travel, am I actually immersing myself in the space, in the environment, in the culture, keeping in mind it's a privilege to be able, we can go out to different spaces as Americans and be really accommodated in most spaces, right? Most other countries are learning English, are immersed in American culture. So that's a lot of privilege that we hold. So we have a really deep responsibility to be mindful of how we're educating. So that came up a lot, right? How are we educating ourselves? And kind of being mindful of, you know, where our understandings are coming from. And that's exactly what self-reflexivity is, right? Is interrogating the roots of those ideas, those values, those practices, behaviors, and whether or not they're rooted in kind of oppressive ideas and oppressive behaviors, whether intentional or not, right? Intention versus impact. It doesn't matter if we have good intentions, as they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? What matters is the impact of our actions. And then taking accountability. And I think someone spoke to that already with the toxic positivity and gaslighting, right? It's not for us to say, as someone said earlier, it's not for us to say whether or not we've caused harm to somebody else, right? And kind of invalidate those experiences. It's for us to take accountability. So just being really mindful and humble when we're in other spaces. And I think someone kind of used that language as well. Using, and excuse me, let me not say using, but seeking out mentors from those backgrounds. And maybe that comes with some type of compensation. And I assume it probably does typically come with some type of compensation. And changing mentors is needed. So if there are folks, so even if you're seeking out folks who are coming from those backgrounds, just because I'm a Black person, just because I have Nigerian ancestry, that does not mean I'm an expert on this topic. That doesn't mean I can't come in and completely bullshit about this topic. So don't ever kind of just follow people uncritically. Just because they're a member of the community, there's this idea, we should defer to the leadership. We should defer to the perspectives of the impacted communities or the folks we're talking about. But that does not mean being uncritical, right? We are all capable of causing harm. We are all capable of kind of weaponizing our positions in particular ways. Obviously, that's going to look different depending on who we are and where we're located. But be mindful that just because someone is coming from that cultural background, that doesn't mean that they're not causing harm. That doesn't mean they might not be engaging in exploitative practices, that kind of thing. So you really have to be, you have to kind of keep that on, right? That critical framework for how you're engaging in this kind of work. And I know you've talked about toxic positivity a lot, so I'm going to kind of come at it and talk about spiritual bypassing here in a moment and some of the layers that kind of come in with that. And I'll send you this article that I have up too, just so you have a copy. Being receptive to call-ins is important. And that was actually the comment about, you know, you don't get to say, oh, I didn't hurt you, I didn't offend you, right? But kind of being receptive when you're being called in. And a good practice, a good humbling practice, just to say thank you, you know, thank you for the reminder. So I think actually there may have been some gendered language that came up earlier, right? We do this without realizing it, but in many cases, especially because you hear it a lot, right? And even if you've kind of stopped saying it and you know better, it creeps into your vernacular anyway, and you have to keep checking in. So we tend to say, hey guys, right? And we default to men as a dominant identity. So just being mindful of that, right? Oh, thank you for the reminder, right? That's really important. Is a great practice to kind of be receptive, right? And not reactive, right? Be responsive and not reactive when these types of moments come up. And I'm actually going, I did want to talk about something specific too before we run out of time that I will get to. Let me just make a note of it. I joke that I have trauma brain, so that's why I write a lot of stuff down, because if I don't write it down, I'm going to forget. And I'm like my father, he's like, go, 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 speaking really quickly, a lot of ideas. So I will lose my train of thought. And you know, Alex. So,
yeah.
Same way.
Yeah. Yeah, we actually, we do talk a lot about spiritual bypassing as well. I actually think that some of the newer students, not as much. It used to be something that I ranted about all the time. I got a little self-conscious of my midnight rants, so I stopped. And so we don't talk as much about those things because sometimes in a class setting, I forget to bring up the things that I rant about. So yeah, but...
My apologies. I'm just deferring back to the comments. I'm just trying to stay on top of this. Let me get back into the comments. So yeah, I agree with checking into resources. before you buy things to make sure you're not exploiting particular communities. One thing I want to say about that too is sometimes there are particular items that are really specific to specific traditions. So you've all probably been in like a spiritual shop. I don't know what you kind of call them, but you know, you get your crystals, they've got sage, they've got a little bit of everything, right? They have all of these different cultures kind of meshed into this one space. And maybe some traditions that are contradictory, you know, don't really coexist, are not complementary, and are really sometimes not up for the taking. So I think also being mindful of, and you folks have used that language of like, when is this an open practice? When is this something I'm actually invited to participate in? And as some of you mentioned, those communities will invite you in like directly, right? And allow you to participate in those spaces. And so that's a really great opportunity to connect with those folks. And sometimes, and let me say, not even sometimes, it's never appropriate to kind of seek out those communities or seek out, I should say, entrance into those communities. So especially with Native folks, and not saying that this has happened, but just something to be mindful of. When we want to learn, just make sure that we're not kind of approaching and trying to gain access or trying to kind of ask for access into the communities, but be invited, right? And come in that kind of way. Just because because of that extensive history of colonization, right? In a lot of cases, Indigenous communities may or may not feel comfortable kind of welcoming folks into the community, especially white folks, right? Just because of those histories. And it's not just colonization in the context that I've talked about it, right? Genocide, displacement, destruction of the land, but also like there are things that are still happening, right? There are more kind of contemporary manifestations of these things as well. So I think just to reiterate, overall in general, I think being mindful of when and where it is appropriate and where it might not be appropriate. And you'll always have those folks in the community who will let you know, here's when it's appropriate, here's when it's not appropriate. So just to give an example, and just to address a comment that was made, I actually do travel for the sake of teaching. So that's something that we can always talk about. I was actually just in New Mexico last week working with a spiritual community. And the indigenous community, so they live in Taos, New Mexico. It's right on the border of Colorado and New Mexico. And so the Taos Indians would be the indigenous folks in that area. They actually helped this community to build a lot of domes and things for the community. They engaged in some spiritual practices together, things like that, and did offer a level of support and open participation there. But in particular ways, they did say, here are things that are not appropriate. It's not appropriate to use this language. It's not appropriate, to call this sitting practice this name that we use, right? This is our language. You can call it this instead. So usually there will be some guidance provided when there is that welcoming, when there is that invitation that comes up. So that's really important. So I appreciate that you folks are using that language of like, when is it an open practice? And that's not something that I've heard before. I appreciate as well talking about challenging discrimination when it comes up. That's really important. So when we have privilege, especially, right, we've got that responsibility to challenge privilege, and especially when you're engaging with these cultures. So kind of jumping back to what I was saying about kind of the appropriation piece, we can also just think about it in the context of consumption for the sake of and consuming, participating in Black culture, just to kind of say, well, I've got that exposure, I have that connection, I've got that relationship, and therefore I'm not complicit in these things, right? So it gets used in that kind of way. And if you folks are interested, there's a really great article by Bell Hooks called Eating the Other, Desire and Resistance, that actually can send you a copy if you're interested, so do let me know. I can always send you readings. I am a professor, so if you ever want free articles, just let me know what topics, and I will always give you free access. But it's really important to divest from privilege by calling out when you see it happening, when you see it being weaponized, when you see people engaging in anti-Blackness. So I appreciate that. And that's a big part of our traditions, right? We even have a god that's like the god of oppression, right? Anansi. So it's really central to participating in these traditions and doing this work. And bearing witness. So the language wasn't used. I don't know if you folks have heard the term bearing witness, but bearing witness means, we are listening to other people's experiences, and we're listening, as folks already said, not to respond, not to kind of give a response, or not to kind of engage in debate, not to ask people to kind of prove to us or get us to be in a position to kind of validate their perspective. So someone made a comment about sometimes when we're speaking to people, they kind of play devil's advocate, and it's kind of, well, I don't understand it, or I don't believe it, I don't know this, and therefore you're wrong, right? And they kind of become this gatekeeper where they're the authority. They're making themselves an authority figure on knowledge. And unless you convince them of what you're saying, you're incorrect. So yeah, challenging that kind of stuff when it comes up, not engaging and listening to kind of take those moves, right? When we're talking about marginalized folks, whether we're talking about race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, citizenship status, so on, what becomes important when we're talking about these different identities is that, what was I going to say? I lost my train of thought. 1 second, I'm sure it'll come back to me. But when we're bearing witness, when we're listening without judgment, oh, there we go. Okay. Our realities are not intellectual exercises, right? They're not intellectual debates. So that's something to keep in mind. We're talking about people's real experiences. And sometimes when we're having these conversations and talking about the histories, people's mind go to, we're talking about opinions, right? We're talking about difference in opinion. No, we're talking about people's lived experiences. So we want to kind of listen to learn. And part of learning and part of empathizing is not centering ourselves, not trying to find a way, how can I make this relevant to my experience, right? It might not be relevant. And that might be exactly the point when it's not relevant. And let me say something about that. So when we're not experiencing oppression, we are privileged, right? It's relational. So it's not possible for people to have a lack of particular resources without those resources having gone somewhere, right? So there's always that relationship. Even when we think this stuff isn't relevant to us, it is, right? So figuring out what is my relationship to this, if I'm not impacted. So really quickly, you might not be a Black person. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're not impacted by these systems. You might just not be impacted in the same ways, to the same degrees, et cetera, right? There might be some distinctions and variations in our experiences. So that's something that becomes important as well, right? There might be some parallels that become important, but we want to be careful about not conflating our experiences, not decentering the experiences of Black people and centering our own. We want to be really careful about not engaging in those practices, right? And we don't need to center ourselves to empathize. We don't need to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. We need to understand, what is it like to be in my shoes? What does it mean to be a white working class woman? What does it mean to be a Black trans woman? Something very different and very distinct. So we want to be able to kind of unpack that and understand kind of those layers. One thing I wanted to say about the ethical consumption. No, never mind. I was going to say, so this is not in the spiritual context. I mean what I said about that already. But generally speaking, in a general context, ethical consumption under capitalism is not possible, but we do the best we can. And that's the point, right? We want to be as mindful and conscious as we can. And with spiritual practices, we do have more freedom to be mindful. One thing I've talked about with the hoodoo traditions, we're talking about enslaved people here who were given scraps to live off of. They didn't have clothing, money. They barely had clothing that was adequate. Didn't have access to food, right? They were kind of given the scraps. So a lot of the soul food, right? Pig intestines and the chitlins and cornbread and things like that actually came from the scraps that were kind of left over. So for these folks who are engaging in these spiritual practices, they were using what they could find. They were using what they could access, right? So having that particular stone, having that particular herb, that's not what's important necessarily, right? We might not have access always to these resources, but we do what we can, we use what we can. So that's a part of these traditions, especially in the context of slavery, especially in the context of the United States and other places where slavery was happening, Brazil, Cuba, etc. But that's something to be mindful of, right? And again, that goes back into the question of access. And even with the stones, something that I said before is when we go into those stores and we're buying these jewels and things, just the kind of mining for these resources because of their popularity, that's something that we have to be mindful of, right? What are the ecological consequences of that, that we need to be mindful of? And in many cases, another thing that I said is these stones in many cases have been modified by humans as a way of making them more appealing, right? So adding dyes to stones to make them more vibrant and colorful, right? Reshaping the stones in particular ways to make them more appealing. So all of this stuff comes with consequences. So being more mindful of how that connects to our relationship to the earth, right? What are the implications, the larger implications there? And I know someone mentioned that before, right? With being mindful of also, is this exploiting particular people, right? And those environments. And that would actually be connected to the topic of environmental racism, right? The fact that these environmental pollutants or environmental degradation tends to happen particularly in those poorer nations, and more so in poor communities of color, right? And so that's environmental racism. So that can be another element, another part of the conversation. Someone mentioned the significance of knowing our history, and I think we talked about that before. And I know when many of us were meeting in the beginning, we were having conversations about also experiencing in many cases some of those disconnects from our ancestral traditions. And I did mention again, coming into the American identity, right? We take on a racial identity in many cases, and we get stripped away of our ethnic identity. That's where the culture is, right? Part of our ethnicity is our geographic place of origin, our culture, right? All of those cultural values, practices, things like that. So we lose a lot of that. We lose a lot of that connection. Having that's important because we start to understand, you know, when we take on racial identities, it becomes this kind of system of division, right? We've naturalized particular differences. And what I mean by that is think about how we talk about gender, right? We try to talk about men and women. First of all, we reinforce the assumption that there are only cisgender men and women, right? So that's one piece of it. We normalize cisgender identity. And then we kind of make these assumptions that men are just naturally stronger, smarter, engage in better emotional regulation than women, right? We do the same thing with race. We assign these different meanings onto people, and we assume that they're naturally occurring, and we use that to create these divisions. So tracing back and getting back into our own roots becomes a way of kind of getting away from some of our own kind of colonial mindsets and practices that we might not even realize because we're so disconnected from that history that we're still kind of engaging in particular ways. And so it's really important to recognize, and this is a practice that will take time to develop, and it's always going to be a practice that, you know, I don't believe in perfection. I don't believe in endpoints. We're always kind of working towards and continuing to do the work. So recognizing our privilege and understanding it, right? It's going to be different. The privileges we hold are the same, right? But depending on the context that we're talking about, which social issues are we talking about, which communities are we talking about, different aspects of our position are going to become relevant. So being able to kind of unpack from one context to the next, what's important here? Well, maybe I'm coming from this space of Western privilege, right? We've come from this space of privileging a Western perspective. What are my responsibilities here? What's my role in all of this, right? In that kind of colonial mindset. Maybe I've participated in particular ways in these colonial ideas without even recognizing it. So, you know, it's important to recognize the privilege, right? And we do need to call it out. We have that responsibility to call it out, right? When we have privilege, we actually intentionally do not address it and don't illuminate it. And that's a way of protecting it. So we actually do have to call it out. That's why we say cisgender, right? Rather than just kind of referring to cisgender folks as men and women and then saying trans, right? Because what happens is we're normalizing those who have privilege, right? So we usually say people, and then we say Black people, Native people, right? People of color. Well, what are we doing? We're normalizing white identity. That's why white people sometimes get really shaken and upset when they hear people say white people. They're not used to their identity being illuminated, right? They're used to being kind of used as a standard of humanity, and that has to do with colonization and the standard of human progress. So we have to be mindful of that, right? We have to call in those identities, otherwise we normalize them. One thing I'm teaching an intro to Africana studies class right now, and this week, one thing I was talking about is human zoos. So we actually put African people into zoos, into zoo exhibits with animals as a way, and in many cases naked, as a way of saying, look at the animals in their natural habitat, right? They're animalistic, they're closer in proximity to the primitive, they're not human, they're not like us humans, right? So white Christian became equated with human, and especially white Christian man, right? Because women were legally still considered property. So some of us have historically for centuries been humanized at the expense of other groups being dehumanized. So we want to be mindful of those types of things, right? Recognizing, calling out the privilege so that we're not kind of participating in the normalization of privileged identities and protecting the privilege by not bringing it to the light, right? We have to illuminate it to understand it. So it becomes important to call it out, right? That's a part of divesting from it as well, or the first step in kind of divesting from it. Another thing that I want to address, one thing to be mindful of is we don't want to use our lack, when we don't have knowledge about something, we don't want to use that lack of knowledge as a way of kind of getting away from doing the work or avoiding doing the work. So there was this one incident, for example, where I was going to a particular protest, and it was centering on the lives of undocumented people, right, and family separations. And I had invited a friend to come with me, and she said, well, I don't know enough about it, so I'm not going to go. So what happened was avoiding and kind of deflecting that responsibility to do the work and using that lack of knowledge as kind of a way of justifying not participating in the work. So not knowing something is not a good excuse to kind of not participate, right? Maybe we're actively listening and that's how we're participating in this moment, but maybe we come in later as we're becoming more knowledgeable, and maybe we're connecting with folks who are coming from similar backgrounds and supporting each other and doing this kind of learning and unlearning process together. So there are ways that we can kind of show up and do the work, and being mindful of kind of the spaces that you're in, right? That kind of depends on, or, you know, the spaces that you're in are going to kind of inform how you should show up. So this work should be done by white people, right? But maybe sometimes it's important for white folks to kind of get together and have these conversations, you know, how, you know, what are our positions in all of this? What are our responsibilities? How can we better understand white supremacy culture and how we're participating in it, right? And it's white supremacy culture, right? So when we're saying whiteness, we're referring to white supremacy culture. Anyone can participate in that, right? I can participate in that, right? We all can, we all do. So that's something to be mindful of as well. I'm going to pull that up here in a minute. But one of the things that I spoke to already that was a part of whiteness culture is this idea that there's only kind of one correct perspective, right? And that would be the Western perspective. And particularly kind of the white perspective on how folks of color are viewed, whether that be Asian folks and Arab folks, right? They get viewed through a very specific framework called Orientalism. Black folks and indigenous folks who have been seen as kind of savage, animalistic, less than human, right? So we want to be kind of mindful of those frameworks and how we might kind of be participating in them, engaging in them, or how can we challenge them as well? You know, how can we learn more about these things? One thing, again, just being mindful, when are the times where this is a moment for me to listen? When is this a moment for me to speak up? So if, for example, someone made an inappropriate comment, that would be a perfect time for someone with privilege to speak up and say something, right? We have this idea that to do the work means white people are not supposed to participate in the conversation or they should just remain silent. I don't agree with that, right? To me, that means not doing the work. So there are moments to actively listen, and that's a form of participation, right? That's a form of being present and doing the work. But there also might be times to jump in. So challenging, acting out, you know, engaging in some bystander intervention when you see people engaging in racism against people of color. Those would be the moments to kind of jump in. So you have to kind of read the room, right? And understand, well, what space am I in? Is it appropriate in this space? Is this the appropriate context? It may or may not be, right? But again, this is one of those situations where we want to understand the context and kind of take it by, as a case by case basis. Because what can unintentionally happen, depending on the context, is we might be kind of putting that work back onto people of color, right? Who are already doing the work. So I teach Africana studies, and something that happens a lot is, universities are already primarily white institutions, meaning the bulk of the student population, faculty, administrative staff are already primarily racially white. But what happens is, despite the fact that the bulk of my students are coming in and they're racially white, the students of color that I have, I also teach multiculturalism. So when I'm teaching these topics for folks who are actually being reflected in the material, the work is falling back onto them to kind of speak to their experience, to speak to what they know, to challenge particular ideas. So they shouldn't have to do all of the work. And we want to kind of think about it that way, right? How do I kind of gauge when it's appropriate to participate and when to kind of take a step back and listen, because there are those moments where intervention is important and necessary. There's one thing I'd like to come back to that was actually a specific example that was mentioned. And I think if we've got some time, maybe processing around that would be important. So I'm going to come right back around to that. Someone said release control and admit ignorance. That's really important. And control being rooted in power, right? So what does it mean to kind of relinquish a sense of control? Okay. Some of this we're going to come back around to. And so one thing that I think we've again spoken to is this idea of open practices. And one thing that we're talking about the context of non-European traditions. So being open, that's kind of inherent to non-European practices in many contexts, where we don't operate out of a space of exclusion. Exclusion is kind of a very Western way of engaging, a very Western kind of framework or way of conducting space. So you will see that a lot, right? Where it's like, this is an open space. With that being said, though, that doesn't necessarily mean that these spaces are always going to be open to everyone, right? There are always boundaries, and the boundaries can always shift. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that. There are actually, I said that there was one specific example that came up. There's actually one that I was going to bring in as well. So I'd like to talk about both, but if we don't have time, we can also bring this conversation into next week. But it's really important to address some of the concerns that were brought up that we've kind of spoken to a little bit already, but I'd love to give more time and space for that. So yeah, with those boundaries, they can always shift. And I can just give a quick example because I think actually I've come down to the last thing I was going to talk about. So one thing that you folks may or may not have noticed is this class is not mandatory for your certificate, I think is what it is. Would you mind elaborating?
Yes, so we offer different certifications, as all of you know, but all of them are not accredited. They are just part of the academy to gain leadership roles within this academy and to also give you a sense of kind of answering the question of what classes should I take if I'm really interested in blank.
Thank you. So that's, this class has been removed from those kind of mandatory, the list of mandatory courses. And I just wanted to kind of address that really quickly. So the reason that I wanted to do that is I would rather not have folks in the space who don't want to be here or kind of have a reluctance to be in the space, have maybe, what's the word I'm looking for here? I can't think. But I don't want folks to kind of be in the space when they don't want to be here, kind of out of sense of obligation, because what ends up happening is the course becomes more of a means to an end, rather than folks kind of being here because they have an appreciation or a respect for these traditions. And again, these are traditions that Europeans have tried to completely eradicate. So to be able to take up space here is really, it's a sacred space, right? For me, as someone who this represents kind of addressing that severing of my own ancestral traditions, my own identity, right? And being able to have that access. It's very sacred, it's very important. So I don't want this course to be something that can kind of be exploited for personal benefit, right? You're kind of getting something out of it, or it's to check a box off for some type of kind of, I don't want to call it a reward, but along those lines, some kind of personal benefit. So I think that's really important. I don't want to say that this space is for everybody. It's not going to be for everybody. There might be some folks who don't appreciate this kind of content. There are folks who may be used to being centered, who would prefer to be centered everywhere that they go in a world that, that's something that they're used to. So yeah, I don't want to make space for folks who don't want to be here. I'd rather be working with and engaging with folks who want to be here, right? I have to work with folks who are reluctantly in my spaces as a part of my job, right? And with that comes a lot of oppressive violence. So I don't want to open up that kind of space here. So I just think that's important to talk about. And that's where I'm kind of making that connection a little bit to the conversation on appropriation. Obviously, unless you're actually using this content for your own kind of personal career, that's a little bit different, right? So exploitation, just in the sense that you'd be getting something, some kind of a personal gain or benefit out of it, and kind of using it, in that way. And then discarding it, right? And again, that history of white folks being able to use and discard Black culture, and discard it when it's no longer kind of profitable, flashy, whatever the case may be. So that's something that I want us to kind of be mindful of when we're engaging in the space. You don't have an obligation to be here, so I hope that you're here because you want to be here and that you would love to learn about these traditions. And again, there are several nations that we're going to be going over that we could go over here, right? It's a really expansive topic. And to kind of say, I'm not interested in Black traditions, that's anti-Blackness, right? And we need to interrogate the roots of that. And I don't want people like that in this space, just to be quite blunt. So that would be something to kind of sit with. One thing that I wanted to come back around to that was kind of brought up is if we can talk about, and this would be something that Alex it might be better for you to facilitate, just based on a point that was coming up. And I wanted to speak to this really quickly as well. So I don't remember if I don't know that I shared this resource directly, but this is something I'd be willing to share. One thing I'll say with this is content that I have created for the sake of someone getting a publication. So this would be copyrighted. So please don't use this for any particular purposes, but for the sake of education. I've done extensive research actually talking about the history of, first of all, pre-colonial Indigenous communities and their identities, which were completely outside of the context of what we would understand as gender and sexuality, right? These were not identities. All of these identities, race, class, gender, etc., right? These are socially constructed identities we've, in the West have imposed. So these type of identities didn't exist. So those would kind of be looking at what did those identities look like back then? So people's, as we would kind of consider gender, was actually defined by their societal roles and their expression. So we saw that kind of that spectrum of expression happening. It also gets at the colonial aspect. So here's when colonization happened. And then the post-colonial, here's how we're reclaiming our traditional identities, right? And obviously that gets complicated because of colonization. So even with reclamation, two-spirit, that's a gender identity. Well, gender is a very Western concept, right? We've been forced into these systems. And so in some regards, we still operate out of them, right? We still use colonial language in some cases. We still operate through those frameworks sometimes. So it's complicated. And I ask you folks to be mindful of that. Even for, Native folks who have been through Indian boarding schools, right? You see that happen where there's a lot of reinforcing of those dominant perspectives, ideologies, these gender binaries, heteronormativity. So this kind of thing happens, and it's a really complicated history. One thing that I've talked about before is because of the fact that African spiritual traditions were completely banned, what happened was a lot of African folks were actually using Catholicism and using Catholic saints and praying to, or using Christianity, right? And doing it that way as a way of trying to continue engaging in their own practices. Obviously, they had to shift and change the practices in particular ways in order to mask that they were still engaging in their own traditions. And so that came with bringing in and weaving in Christianity and Catholicism, which were used to colonize them, right? Commit violence against them, exploit them. So it's a complicated history. And so as we're making these moves, we want to be very careful how we are kind of addressing these issues, because we should be getting outside of these binaries. And we have to understand that it's messy work. We have to be careful, especially when marginalized folks are the ones teaching this, right? How has a legacy of colonization informed the ways that sometimes we do use colonial systems, right? Or reinforce these systems. And being mindful, when we're coming from a space of privilege, we have to be really mindful of how we're engaging in addressing those things with those members of the community. So we're not engaging in power moves. So those are just some things to be mindful of. I do know that there are some people, and if any of you folks know and would be able to put in the comments, there are folks who talk about, rather than like the sacred masculine, the sacred feminine, and kind of talking about these separate entities, there are folks who kind of talk about the masculine and the feminine as a spectrum, and what is, how are both kind of implemented? What does that spectrum, that fluidity kind of look like? So if you folks know of any practitioners that do that, I think that'd be a great resource just to share with the group. But there was interest, and there were these questions of how can we kind of address the issues of heteronormativity, right? The normalization of heterosexuality. I think the gender binary may have also been mentioned as well. And one thing I want to be mindful of, again, just really quickly, when we're bringing that kind of stuff up, make sure you're not bringing it up as a way of decentering race, right? We default sometimes. So we're talking about race here. So when we bring other things in, yes, right, that's important. But we still need to identify our relationships within the context of the power dynamics we're talking about, and understand that when we're talking about gender, when we're talking about sexuality, sure, this is important, but homophobia, for example, or transphobia, or other forms of discrimination against white people, that's going to be compounded for people of color who are experiencing all of those things and racism. So we don't want to center ourselves in a way that's decentering people of color. So that's just something, and not saying that that's happening, but just something to be mindful of, right? We don't want to kind of do the whatabouts, right? What about me, or recentering in a way that might be decentering other folks in the conversation. So that's just something to be mindful of. But I really do want to offer the space to kind of address that question. I think it's important. And if there's room to talk about it more, if we need more time next week, we can also do that. I wanted to offer this. It's kind of an extensive document. So if you were dedicating to doing the work, it is 38 pages. And actually, you know what, a lot of the end, if you're interested in learning more, is just resources. So the last, let me see. Okay, the last 3-4 pages are just resources. So if you wanted to learn more, so it's a little bit extensive, but there's some really great stuff here. And there's a really great book called, oh yeah, go ahead.
I'm so sorry. Would this be something that would be okay for me to add to the website, or to add as a link or a source, or would it be copywritten if it was on my website?
No, you can use this.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Go on.
Yeah. So I'll send you a PDF of this. You can put it on the website.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Okay, so I just wanted to make space for that question of, can we kind of address the ways that when readings are done, when we're engaging in some of these practices, we are reinforcing kind of the gender binary and heteronormativity. And let me just see really quickly if there was anything else that came with that. Yeah, so how can we bring, non-binary practices, teachings in? How can we kind of get away from kind of reinforcing the status quo, right, of heteronormativity, of white supremacy, et cetera, but especially emphasis on gender and sexuality? I'm just going to look at how the question was framed in the chat really quickly as well. Oh, I don't think I can do that while I'm sharing my screen.
So I guess one thing that I wanted to bring up with that, it's really, as Corey has mentioned, because it is so woven into Western culture, it has become almost a definition. And that is the issue that I'm having, and the issue that I know that a lot of other professors, not other professors, that Micah, me and Micah have had this discussion. For those of you who have taken Micah's class, she's wonderful, but we have had this conversation where it has become a definition. The word feminine energy, normally, even if we don't mean it, it has nothing to do with a girl. It has nothing to do with a female. It has nothing to do with gendering or people's private parts or anything like that that would be considered what Western culture tries to identify as female. It has become this definition of using the word feminine energy instead of an ideology and a concept. And that has become really difficult because it's so woven into the way that we teach, the way that we learned, the way that our mentors instructed us about astrology, about many different forms, tropical astrology, about tarot that originated from certain places, such as the Middle East and such as Italy. It has become an ideology and a definition. And that is where both of us are working to try and figure out how we change that language. And yeah, that's just.
Did anyone want to speak to that really quickly? And have you, can I just ask, because I've heard similar things, right, where it's being spoken about more as energies rather than bodies. So when you're engaging in the, because I don't know how many folks are, I'm sure many folks are doing these types of classes where they're using those types of readings. And again, part of it might also be, you know, are folks able to attend all the time, and maybe it was something that was covered and they just kind of missed it? Are you kind of having these conversations about the energies and decentering the significance of bodies when you're kind of talking about the feminine and the masculine energies?
Yes, especially for the people who have taken tarot, we spend probably, I mean, there have been a couple classes that were solely dedicated to, especially when we talked about the court cards. Because the court cards in tarot, not only do they have a lot of other symbology that has come from a lot of different places across the world, which is also something that we need to address and talk about, but also this idea of the king and the queen and the feminine and masculine energy and what that means and what it meant and how the language has been used. And we have had the discussion in class of what that means to us and what does feminine energy even mean? What does masculine energy even mean? And what was it meant to mean when people started using that language, and how can we change and adapt to that now? And what does it mean when you change and adapt the language? And so we've had that discussion in tarot. And I know in astrology, Micah brings it up that it has absolutely nothing to do with body and that we're just talking about an ideology and energy. And we're just talking about a philosophy, a philosophical concept. But I don't know if in Micah's class they've actually had that discussion. I'm not in all of Micah's classes. So I know that Kevin and Kieran are in most of Micah's classes, so I'm sure they can also add insight to that as well.
With that being said, because it was brought up, I think, by a couple folks, I just want to put the question out there. And if you need a minute to kind of type up your response, we can always come back to this. Oh, cool. Yeah, and there is a response. Perfect. So we'll probably come back to this conversation next. And I'm not cutting it off yet, but just to say, I want to make sure we have enough space to have this conversation, and I don't want to kind of take time away from this. So we can always come back to this and start again. The question, and I'll type it up as well. It was just with what Alex was saying about how in the context of tarot, there have been discussions about decentering the body in the ways we understand feminine and masculine, and thinking about it more as energies rather than as having to do with gender or biological sex or anything like that. Do you have other questions? Do you have other needs? Are there things that you feel would better support you in, again, moving towards more of kind of a non-binary framework, those types of things? Do you have other things you wanted to contribute to the conversation? And keeping in mind, we will come back to this next time too, just so that we're not cutting this conversation short.
Also, I mean, if other people are okay with it as well, we did start 10 minutes late. So going 10 minutes over is completely fine with me if it's okay with Corey and with everybody else here. But I think that, yeah, I would love to know too, because I mentioned, and as Kieran brought up, because it's used as a placeholder, it's used as an ideology, it's used as a definition for a bigger, larger concept. What type of language would you like to see used? I would love to know. I would love to know what kind of language to use instead of those. You're right, because they are. And I completely, you're right, they are binary. Just in using those terms, I am using binary language. And how to step away from that, I am not sure. I know, obviously, using language that is non-binary. I obviously use it. I have lots of friends who use the language for themselves and for their bodies and for their energy and for their purpose of themselves. But using it as an ideology is, specifically for me, is not new because I've studied so many cultures that do that anyway. But it's new when it comes to tropical astrology and when it comes to discussing tarot cards that were created in certain parts of the world where that language for that specific ideology and that energy was used. And so I would love to know what kind of language you would like to see used. Oh, thank you, Corey, for the resource and the link. I've also studied with, you know, as I said, I've had the privilege to study with people from all over the world and in different languages as well. This type of language of feminine and masculine energy being used in other languages. And so changing the way that we discuss it in English also brings up, I don't know, there's a lot there because I learned from a lot of different, like I said, tarot has been used by multiple cultures all over the world, even indigenously, even anciently. Tarot is a very old practice depending on what you're talking about, depending if you're talking about just the numerology that's used. It's a very ancient practice. And so how that language would translate as well into other languages and just there's a lot. There's a lot to unpack when it comes to using binary language as far as ideologies and energies.
I'm gonna just say that I feel like these terms have come, I mean, these are old traditions in every society and every culture has had that masculine and feminine sides to it, the yin and yang, you know, the balance to life. And I believe that masculine and feminine energy aren't binary. I think that they're very fluid and that we in our limited mind frame have just created a label to stick us somewhere. I don't think they're necessarily a bad thing. I think we can use them and weaponize them like you can do with pretty much anything. But I think that, and then, you know, when it comes to people, you know, it's the influx of both that makes us who we are. You know, whether or not I have a vagina is irrelevant in my opinion. I mean, I'm extremely fluid, so so I don't know, that's just my thought process on that.
Thank you. And I agree completely with what you said. Is that Kieran or Kevin? Kieran. I totally, completely agree with what you said, that I never want to use the language as if masculine means aggressive and feminine means passive. Things like that, I completely agree, are things that we want to step away from and things that we want to use different language for. I mean, solely just using the word passive to describe a passive person. And if the card is defining, you know, in tarot, I'm talking specifically, but if the card itself is describing a passive situation or a passive person, just using the word passive and not trying to use the word feminine to somehow mean things like that. And that's where I say that feminine and masculine energies should be a philosophical ideology and concept outside of our weird stereotypical westernized ideas of what feminine should mean. But yeah. Yeah, and totally. In many cultures, there are tons and tons of different genders that have nothing to do with the binary system that we have created in the West. Even the cultures that tarot stem from have many, many, many more genders. Especially, I mean, if you talk about India, a lot of tarot originated in India. And discussing and talking about the multiple genders that have existed throughout India for thousands of years. It's and I think that that's somewhere that I could learn and grow, is maybe seeing how those ideologies behind those genders could translate to tarot. And I definitely think that's something that I could learn and grow and learn from that, and learn more about what kind of philosophical ideologies that exist behind the multiple genders that exist in India, and how those translated to tarot and how they read tarot in India. For sure. Mhm.
One
Yeah.
thing I want to mention is when we use the language of mix or blend when we're talking about identities, that is actually contradictory to the concept of a spectrum, because a mix or blend relies on the idea that you are measuring distinct and measurable identities. So this would kind of reinforce the idea that gender is biological and can be measured in parts, essentially. That's why the language of mixed, when we're talking about race, is also not appropriate. It actually relies on the idea that these are things that exist on a biological level and can be measured. So I just want to challenge that framework a little bit. With two-spirit, and if you do read the document that I sent Alex, and I may actually be able to upload it here too. But Alex will put it on the website. I think that might be easier. Two-spirit is very specific to the reclamation of Indigenous folks' pre-colonial identities and their expressions that were outside of the concepts of gender and sexuality. So I just want to emphasize that that's not something for us, if we're not coming from those traditions, for us to kind of use or take. This is really specific to Indigenous folks in the United States, Canada, Alaska Natives, Australia. So it's very specific to particular folks. It's a very specific context of reclaiming those identities that were lost because of European colonialism and colonization. Colonialism being the ideology, colonization being the act itself, just to distinguish. One thing about dismantling these binaries or doing the work of what's called decolonizing. So with decolonizing, we are kind of uprooting and dismantling the ways that we are engaging in colonial ideologies and practices. What that work necessitates is understanding your ancestral roots. So one thing that you would need to understand is, what did this look like in the context of your ancestors? What were their identities? What were their expressions, right? And again, there are some contexts where we have language that we have created as a way of responding to and combating some of these colonial frameworks. But outside of that, understanding your own roots is going to become really important. I'll give another example. With the appropriation piece, one second here. One thing that happens, just an example of appropriation and needing to know our history. So we have this issue where white people like to wear locks, right? Or dreadlocks. Dreadlocks is not appropriate. It's racialized language. And it makes particular implications about Black people as being seen as dirty, filthy, unkept, unprofessional, unruly, those types of things. And again, very different interpretation on a white body. What happens is white folks like to make this argument that, you know, but the Vikings had locks, right? Well, actually, they didn't. They had a very particular type of braid. So understanding your ancestors, what their traditions were, and being able to kind of connect back to them becomes a really important way of, in many ways, kind of getting outside of our colonial system, keeping in mind that some folks are coming from some of these major European powers, right? So if you're coming from colonial traditions, it's going to be a little bit complicated, but we need to be able to figure out what we are moving back towards, right? Moving back towards our own ancestral teachings and our own ancestral practices. And where they're lost, kind of figuring out how we've created, because we do create language where language did not exist, right, to represent our identities. So that's something to kind of be mindful of. And that gets complicated, right? There are so many different gender identities. I could send you about 20 right now that are rooted in completely non-European cultures. We have a lot of different gender identities. So maybe that's something, and actually let me go ahead and show them to you really quickly. And maybe this is something to consider, is actually using the languages that folks kind of identify themselves with as a move outside of those binaries.
Yeah, thank you. And we can definitely move to having this discussion in class as well, and bringing, you know, even stopping me in class and, you know, saying that you would prefer if we explored different language. And I am always extremely open to criticism, or to even just discussions about how we can change our language and how we can change and just decolonize the way that we think and the way that we interact in class. And I would appreciate that.
Okay. Oh, here we go. Perfect. So I'll just show you a couple of these if I can. And 1 second, I gotta share my screen. Has this conversation come up before?
In tarot, yes. Yep.
Okay.
We have talked about it in tarot. I feel like I don't get, and I understand this. This is a dynamic that's something else that's very Western. I don't get challenged a ton because, you know, I am the professor and they are the students, and I don't like that. And I really try and break down those walls and be like, you know, we're just having a conversation and just talking. But I do understand where the dynamic comes from, where people don't challenge everything that I say, because we have definitely been kind of indoctrinated into a culture where you don't challenge the professor. I don't like that. And I want to change that. But it's definitely a hard dynamic to just kind of instantly change.
If I can, actually, this is already up on the website. I'll just show it one more time, though. I do address some power dynamics that come up in these types of spaces where there's kind of that teacher-student dynamic. And just some of the ways, the frameworks that I think are important to operate out of as a way of kind of challenging some of those power dynamics. And it's not perfect. And those dynamics will exist, but there are kind of particular ways to address them and kind of give more power to the students in the class. So that's something that's in the notes already. And we could always talk about that more going forward.
And I think that that's another thing too that has to do with everything that we're talking about as well, is that, you know, I purposely try to bring professors from many, many, many different backgrounds who have lots of different information coming from different places, as well as different practices. And if you don't agree with what they're saying, you know, I didn't bring them in because I agreed with everything that they said, or I believed everything that they said, or that I don't think that they're problematic at all. I, you know, brought in specific professors, and feel free to challenge all of them. And feel free to discuss and talk and challenge all of the professors. None of them are there because I think that they are somehow better or higher than any of you are.
Is this something that we would like to kind of come back around to, this particular discussion, and kind of talking about tangible ways to address some of those dynamics that are coming up, we can always kind of start with this again next week.
Yeah, I definitely understand that, Kieran, for sure. Interrupting definitely can feel awkward, and it's definitely harder when it's more personal. I totally and completely understand that. A lot of times it's a lot easier, you know, when you're just talking about a theoretical concept. It's much more difficult when you're talking about you and your lived experiences. And I feel, I mean, I purposely, it's very difficult for me to discuss sometimes and talk about issues and oppression that I've seen and felt personally due to being Arabic. And those are much harder conversations for me than other ones. So I totally feel you. Oh, thank you, Ambriana. Very, very much. I try. I really do.
Okay. So I like to take notes about the conversations we have just to kind of get an idea of where we're at, what might be kind of beneficial, and what some of the interests and desires of the group might be, what might be beneficial for the group as far as maybe where some of our understandings and practices are. So I'm going to kind of use this. What I was going to do, wanted to make sure we had an opportunity to kind of be on the same page. So if you wouldn't mind kind of going in and looking at those notes that are already up. We only met 3 times, so it's not too much content. And don't feel like you need to watch everything and engage with everything immediately. But if you wouldn't mind going in there and taking it at your pace and just going into that stuff, I think that it might be beneficial. I can always reiterate some things. It was kind of a deep history lesson when we went over that content the first time, so we can always go over it again. But what I was going to do is move into the Aruba origin story for next week, and maybe we can talk about some of those dynamics that have come up and how we might want to think about addressing them going forward. And we can kind of put that in the context of some of these histories that we've been talking about for the past several weeks when we've had an opportunity to kind of connect. So I'm available. You should be able to find me on the Facebook group page, and you can always contact me there. I don't know if my website or my email is on the website, but you can always email me, and I will give you my work email because I don't read my personal email. So you can send me an email to my work email and I will respond to you there. If you need anything, if you want me to send you any resources, if I can bring particular things into these conversations, please do let me know. But I will always use this information to kind of reshape things as we go. I'm very kind of interactive in that way and try to kind of engage with the group where we're all kind of at. So feel free to reach out if you need anything. I'd like to come back to that conversation next Thursday, and then we could kind of move forward. But I will be available on that group. Otherwise, I don't think there was anything else I had for you. There was a little bit of content we didn't get to cover today that we can cover next week as well. So I hope you all have a good weekend.
Thank you so much, Corey.
Anytime. Feel free to reach out if you ever want to connect, if you ever want to process over things. And I will hopefully speak to you folks next Thursday. Take care.
See you next Thursday. Thank you.